The problem facing British authorities in 1916, after Casement's trial, is that there firstly is a huge backlash against British authority after the execution of the leaders. So when Casement's preliminary hearing happens in the middle of May 1915, 15 leaders have already been executed. And for the authorities in Britain, Casement in many ways is the most dangerous as well as the most problematic of all the leaders, because Casement's presence within 1916 complicates it in a way that turns it from being essentially quite a local uprising centred on Dublin into something much bigger. Casement is very well known internationally. The day after, for instance, the outbreak of the First World War, Casement had an interview with Theodore Roosevelt. During his life, he really has mixed with the high and mighty. He's a man whose own views have been taken at a very high level to be important. He is someone with tremendous gravity and influence, and therefore his transgression or transformation into an Irish revolutionary leader poses a huge problem for British authority. And how do you deal with someone who has been decorated by the monarch and pronounced a hero in organs of the press around the world, and now he is someone who has gone against everything that he supposedly believed in and stood for? So it's clear that his trial has to be treated very, very carefully. It's an extraordinarily sensitive moment. It also happens at a moment when Britain's own relationship to the war is about to change. The trial itself happens at the end of June 1916, the last few days of June, and within 48 hours of the verdict that condemns Casement to death, the Battle of the Somme begins. And of course, the Battle of the Somme is the great symbolic moment in the history of the 36th Irish Division, or the 36th Division, and it has that iconic place within First World War history. And there is also a huge wave of support for Casement around the world. The work he's carried out in sub-Saharan Africa, the work he's done on behalf of the Amazon Indians who have been brutally treated as a result of the international rubber industry. These investigations of crimes against humanity have turned Casement into someone who garners great respect around the world. And therefore, again, the authorities are faced with a problem of public relations above anything. How can you execute a man who has on the surface done so much good for the cause of humanity? So this is the context in which the Black Diaries appear. Casement is also supported by a number of organs of the British press, and soon after his capture, between his imprisonment in the Tower and the opening of his trial at the Royal Courts of Justice, a number of leading journalists who were expressing levels of support for Casement are asked to attend meetings at different parts of government buildings in London, and they are shown extracts from what are purported to be Casement's diaries. And we know that rumour during wartime has an extraordinary power over the public imagination. And quite quickly, the stories of these diaries mushroomed into some really very scurrilous accusations being made against Casement, and the idea that this man couldn't be held up as a hero because actually he was sexually transgressive, as we would say today. But we have to understand that homosexuality in 1916 was a very different state of being than it is in the 21st century. And what is clear is that the issue of Casement's sexuality is being used as a weapon against him, is being used as a means of destroying his reputation in the public imagination. And many believed that if those diaries hadn't appeared, that the authorities wouldn't have been able to have executed Casement, that public outcry would have demanded clemency, and therefore some would make the argument, or the argument at least can be made, that Casement was executed for his alleged sexuality, which is very interesting. And for that reason, some people have held him up as a gay martyr. But there is a whole other school of thought that argues that, in fact, the sexual narrative about Casement is itself a total invention that emerges out of the fevered imagination of the British intelligence services faced by heroic Irish nationalists who needs to be undone and in a way demythologized within the Irish public imagination. So the presence of these diaries that are very skillfully used in 1916 to wage a public relations campaign against Casement, after his execution, they disappear from sight and don't really re-emerge until the late 1950s, when they are finally partially released into the public domain. And a huge debate continues to this day on the issue of their authenticity. But let's return to the trial. The trial itself can be seen in some ways to have strong parallels to a Stalinist show trial of the 1930s, in the sense that the authorities use it as a way by which they construct and enforce new forms of identity and masculinity, and show, how not to be. Casement, the arch traitor, the man who has betrayed his country, he's betrayed his class, he's betrayed his sexuality. You can't really get worse than that. And the newspapers make hay from this. They really go to town on Casement. There's a huge amount of publicity, and quite definitely a lot of that publicity, both before and after his trial, affects the verdict of not just the jury during his trial, but the efforts at his appeal to have a plea of clemency granted. So there's this tremendous amount of behind the scenes politicking in the shadow of Casement's trial, which in many ways makes it very difficult to decipher, and especially when you get that combustible mix of politics and the law coming together, and it gets very, very messy. The other issue, I suppose, which shouldn't be forgotten, is that the Casement's prosecutor was F.E. Smith, the future Lord Chancellor of England, and F.E. Smith had galloped the castle. He was very senior within the whole unionist, the ranks of political unionism, so that the trial itself becomes this very, very big political moment. And there have been efforts ever since to try and suggest it was otherwise, to see it as actually a case of British fair justice, but it wasn't. And I think most historians now would agree that it was heavily weighted against Casement. And although I suppose again the big problem was that Casement was the first to admit his treason. So in a way that made a mockery of the law, in the sense that Casement realised that he had to some extent sacrifice himself if an independent Ireland was to come into being, and he's prepared to make that sacrifice. And the law in that sense doesn't really work, because what do you do with a supposed criminal if he actually wants the punishment that you give him? The law to some extent falls apart. So for that reason, another type of punishment was sought, and that was a punishment that in the end was the kind of destruction and assassination of Casement's character in the public imagination.